1943. A Nazi steps off a train in Texas. The blistering heat hits him like a physical blow, a dry, oppressive weight he's never experienced in the forests of Germany or the fields of France. The light is blinding, the landscape vast and alien. He is one of the first, a member of the Afrika Korps, captured in the final collapses in Tunisia. His finely tailored field jacket, the iconic Deutsches Afrika Korps regalia, is now covered in the dust of the American South. He and thousands of his comrades are about to be processed into a system that will defy all their expectations of captivity. They are not headed for a grim, barbed wire fortress of starvation and punishment, as dictated by their own propaganda. They are entering what they will soon, with a mixture of awe and cynical humor, dub the Fritz Ritz. This is the story of the Axis prisoner of war camps in the United States during World War II, a sprawling, secret network where the Geneva Convention was not just followed, but often exceeded, creating a bizarre and paradoxical home front war. By the end of the conflict, over 425,000 Axis POWs would be held on American soil, with Texas hosting the largest number of any state, nearly 80,000 of them in dozens of camps scattered from the Panhandle to the Gulf Coast. This is the story of how America, grappling with its own principles and a desperate need for labor, created a captivity so comfortable it would spark controversy, enable a covert Nazi reign of terror, and leave a lasting, complicated legacy on the Texan landscape. The unexpected guests, from Afrika Korps to the Lone Star State. The first major wave of POWs arrived in the summer of 1943, following the surrender of over 275,000 Axis troops in North Africa. The United States, a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, was obligated to provide housing, rations, and medical care equivalent to its own base-level troops. But the scale of the influx was unprecedented. The domestic POW camp system, managed by the Provost Marshal General's Office, was hastily assembled, often converting old civilian conservation corps camps or building new facilities on vast tracts of government land. Texas was ideal for this logistical nightmare. It had wide-open spaces, a climate that reduced the need for expensive insulated barracks, and a booming agricultural economy that was critically short-handed with so many American men fighting overseas. Major camps sprang up almost overnight. Camp Hearn, located on the Blackland Prairie, Camp Swift near Bastrop, Camp Huntsville in East Texas, Camp Mejia, and the unique Camp Hereford, exclusively for Italian prisoners. The journey for a captured German soldier was surreal. After being processed at a port like Norfolk, Virginia, he would be loaded onto a train with blacked-out windows. For days, he would travel through an America that seemed untouched by war. No bomb craters, no rubble, no starving civilians. The sheer, undamaged prosperity was a psychological blow. Upon arrival in Texas, the reality became even more strange. The camps were not the Stalag Luft of Hollywood myth. They were neat rows of tar-papered or white-painted wooden barracks, each with a pot-bellied stove, electric lights, and proper bunk beds with mattresses. They had running water, shower houses, and latrines that were, by 1940 standards, hygienic and modern. U-boat crewman Hans Gabler, captured and sent to Camp Hearn, recalled his astonishment. "We expected to be treated badly, to be beaten, to starve. Instead, we were given clean clothes, a barrack, and more food than we had seen in years. It was confusing. We thought it must be a trick." Life in the Ritz, the Geneva Convention, and American abundance. The Fritz Ritz moniker was born from this stark contrast. The American adherence to the Geneva Convention was, in part, a strategic calculation. The U.S. wanted its own captured soldiers to be treated well by Germany, and this was a powerful incentive to set a high standard. But it was also a reflection of American abundance and, perhaps, a certain naivete. The daily POW ration, as mandated by the Geneva Convention, was supposed to be equal to that of a base camp American soldier. In practice, in the resource-rich United States, it was often far superior to what a frontline Wehrmacht soldier had been eating. A typical day's menu, as recorded at Camp Swift, included cereal, eggs, bacon, bread, and coffee for breakfast, meat, often beef or pork, potatoes, vegetables, and bread for the midday meal, and a lighter supper. This was a caloric feast. The prisoners were also provided with the same C ration and K ration packs as American GIs for work details outside the wire. Beyond food, the camps were equipped with extensive recreational facilities. The prisoners, using their own labor and materials provided by the U.S. Army, built elaborate sports complexes. Soccer, or Fußball, was a national obsession. Camps like Herne and Huntsville had multiple meticulously maintained soccer fields where fierce leagues operated, complete with team jerseys and roaring crowds of fellow POWs. They built swimming pools at some camps, like the one at Camp Huntsville, which was dug by hand by the prisoners themselves. They had tennis courts, volleyball courts, and boxing rings. Intellectual and artistic pursuits were heavily encouraged by the American authorities as a means of maintaining morale and preventing trouble. The prisoners established vast libraries with books in German, often supplied by the YMCA or the International Red Cross. They formed orchestras, theater troupes, and choirs. At Camp Herne, prisoners built a full-scale theater with a stage, curtains, and painted backdrops, putting on performances of German classics like Faust. They attended educational classes in everything from mathematics and languages to engineering and agriculture, taught by the many highly educated men within their ranks. Perhaps the most astonishing feature was the canteen. Using canteen coupons earned from their work, also mandated by the Geneva Convention, which required pay for labor, prisoners could purchase goods that were rationed for the American public just outside the fence. They could buy cigarettes, chocolate, Coca-Cola, beer, and even items like cameras and record players. The sight of Nazi prisoners enjoying luxuries that were scarce for the local Texan population did not go unnoticed, and it became a significant source of local resentment. The dark underbelly, the silent war within the wire. However, the Fritz Ritz had a dark and violent secret. The American policy of non-fraternization and the decision to allow the prisoners a high degree of self-governance had a catastrophic, unintended consequence. It allowed the most fanatical Nazis to establish a brutal reign of terror over their fellow prisoners. Within the camps, the German military structure quickly reasserted itself, covertly but powerfully. The highest-ranking German officer, or the most senior non-commissioned officer, would become the secret Lagerführer, camp leader. They were assisted by a secret police force, often composed of hardcore SS men and dedicated Nazis. This shadow hierarchy enforced strict Nazi discipline. Any sign of dissent, defeatism, or worse, friendliness toward the Americans was punished severely. The most feared punishment was the kangaroo court. These were secret tribunals held by the Nazi clique where prisoners accused of being traitors were tried. The sentences were brutal. Victims would be beaten, often savagely. The ultimate punishment was execution, disguised as suicide or an accident. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a prisoner named Johannes Kunz was beaten to death by his comrades for allegedly translating sensitive camp information for the Americans. The murder was only discovered by the authorities, and several perpetrators were later tried and executed at Fort Leavenworth, the only U.S. execution of POWs during the war. Camp Herne became a notorious epicenter for this internal terror. The camp held a significant number of U-boat crewmen and Afrika Korps veterans, many of whom remained fiercely loyal to Hitler. They maintained detailed blacklists of anti-Nazis. These troublemakers had to be segregated for their own safety into separate compounds, a practice the Americans eventually adopted after realizing the extent of the problem. The terror was so pervasive that when American guards entered a barrack, prisoners would often stand at rigid, silent attention, too afraid to speak lest they say the wrong thing and be reported. The American guards, often older men or those deemed unfit for frontline service, were frequently overwhelmed. They were not trained to deal with this kind of sophisticated internal political warfare. They saw a calm, orderly camp on the surface, unaware of the beatings happening in the barracks after dark. It was a silent war, fought with whispers, threats, and clubs made from bed slats. A stark contradiction to the placid, sun-baked image of the Fritz Ritz. The Italian contingent, a different kind of captive. While the German camps were tense with ideological fervor, the experience for the over 50,000 Italian POWs held in the U.S., particularly in Texas, was markedly different. After Italy surrendered in September 1943 and switched to the Allied side, the status of these prisoners changed. They were redesignated as Italian Service Units, ISUs. They wore American-style uniforms with Italy patches on the sleeves and were given far more freedom. Camp Hereford, located in the Texas Panhandle, was the main base for Italian POWs. Dubbed the Alamo of the Plains, it held over 3,000 men. The Italians, largely non-political and weary of war, adapted quickly and cheerfully to their new lives. They were renowned for their artistry and craftsmanship. They built elaborate gardens, fountains, and religious shrines within the camp. Their relationship with the local population was overwhelmingly positive. Italian POWs were hired out as farm labor, and their cheerful demeanor and hard work made them popular. They were often invited into local homes for meals, a stark contrast to the strictly segregated Germans. Many local families have fond memories of the Italian boys who helped bring in the harvest. This fraternization went so far that romantic relationships blossomed, leading to marriages after the war for some. The Italians were not seen as the enemy. They were seen as allies in waiting and a welcome solution to a labor shortage. Their story is a separate, softer chapter in the POW narrative, one defined more by pasta, song, and camaraderie than by Nazi terror and ideological purity. The economic engine, POWs and the Texas war effort. Beyond the cultural oddity, the POW program became an indispensable part of the Texan homefront economy. With millions of American men overseas, a critical labor shortage threatened the harvest of vital crops like cotton, fruit, and timber. The POWs provided the solution. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be compelled to work, and they were paid in canteen coupons. They were used in a huge variety of non-war-related industries. They harvested cotton in the fields around Camp Hearn. They cut timber in the piney woods of East Texas near Camp Huntsville and Camp Lufkin. They worked in rice mills, canneries, and on railroad maintenance. At Camp Hereford, they were crucial to the local onion and grain harvests. This labor was a double-edged sword for local Texans. Farmers were grateful for the help that saved their crops, but they also resented that their sons were off fighting while the very men they were fighting against were being paid to work safely in Texas. There were occasional incidents. Near Camp Huntsville, a local farmer was allegedly stabbed by a POW during an argument, fueling local tensions. Yet for the most part, the work details were remarkably peaceful. The prisoners often preferred being outside the wire, and the American guards, many of whom were local men themselves, developed a pragmatic, sometimes even friendly relationship with their charges. The economic impact was undeniable. It is estimated that Axis POW labor contributed millions of man-hours to the American economy, filling a gap that could have otherwise crippled agricultural production. The Fritz Ritz was not just a place of leisure. It was a significant, functioning part of the American war machine on the home front. Legacy and ghosts. What remains of the Fritz Ritz? With the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the purpose of the camps evaporated. But repatriation was a slow process, lasting well into 1946. For the Nazis, the final months were a time of grim realization as the full horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. The Americans showed them newsreels of the liberated concentration camps. Some remained in denial, claiming it was propaganda. For others, it was the final, shattering blow to their worldview. Once repatriated, the prisoners carried their Texas experience back to a devastated Germany. For some, the memory of American abundance fueled a desire to emigrate. In the post-war years, a number of former German POWs did indeed return to the United States, and specifically to Texas, becoming American citizens. The men they had once fought against were now their neighbors. Today, the physical remnants of the Fritz Ritz are few. Most of the camps were dismantled, the land returned to its original use or developed over. But the ghosts remain. At the site of Camp Hearn, archaeological excavations have unearthed concrete foundations, beer bottles, handmade cigarette lighters, and even a buried metal box that once held a secret radio. A museum there now tells the camp's complex story. At Camp Huntsville, a state historical marker and a memorial to all POWs stand on the campus of Sam Houston State University. The swimming pool built by the prisoners is now filled in, but its outline is still visible. The legacy of the POW camps in Texas is a deeply nuanced one. It is a story of American idealism and abundance colliding with the grim reality of Nazi fanaticism. It demonstrates a nation so confident in its own principles that it extended them even to its enemies, while simultaneously being blind to the brutal internal dynamics it was enabling. The Fritz Ritz was neither a paradise nor a hell. It was a bizarre, temporary world behind the wire, a place where soccer games were played just yards from secret beatings, where the aroma of roasting coffee from the canteen mingled with the ever-present dust of Texas, a profound and contradictory experiment in captivity on the southern plains. Which POW story should we cover next? A. The Sheriff. B. The Christmas Truce. Comment.